some preliminary information, and then we will move into our first interim report. As a set of preliminary information for the group, if you haven't had a chance to review the legislative analysts update recently, what we see there is kind of, I think, the legislators' first experience in dealing with what it's like to work in school district budgeting. So what happened for the legislators, as the world would have it, as it sometimes turns, is they approved a budget without knowing all of the information, which is what we have to do on an annual basis. In doing so, normally the tax revenues are received by the state April 15th. There were deadlines provided to everybody across the state, every county except for one, to turn those tax returns in October. And that later got pushed back to November. So the state adopted their budget without knowing the full scope of their revenue. And now what we're seeing as part of that landscape is a significant gap between the projected revenue that the state would receive and what they're actually receiving. So as we go through the next few months, actually the next month and a half, really, as we start to look at the governor's January budget proposal, which we should see around January 10th, I believe, what we'll see is a significant shortfall in billions of dollars. I think it's estimated, maybe Danny and James can correct me, around $16 billion for the next year. And that's only going to compound itself in the out years. So what is different around this shortfall, which if it does stay true, this would be a historic shortfall, but different than the 08-09 crash that we all experienced, because in this case, there is some money in reserve accounts for the state, the education protection account. We'll have to wait and see in the governor's proposal how much of that he and the legislature are willing to provide to offset the elements that we're facing with this shortfall. But this is a significant issue that we need to be paying very close attention to. One key piece that we look at in our projections is our COLA. And remember that COLA is a statutory number that is calculated based on fixed data points. And we're getting closer and closer to knowing the real COLA for next year. But what we were projecting was somewhere around 3.4, 3.5. And in the last 2 to 3 weeks, the legislative analysts have advised to come down anywhere from 0.5 to 1.5. And their most recent publication suggests that districts look at a 1.27 estimated COLA. So that's well below what we were anticipating. And another consideration there is you might be thinking, well, gosh, COLA is a cost of living adjustment. And in the real world context, that's what it's designed to be. But in the school context, that just means the amount of increased revenue that a school district receives. And that is required for all elements of increased costs for a school district. And so oftentimes what we're hearing and what we're seeing and what you might be thinking is, well, how come the COLA can be so low if inflation is still so high? And so what we look at is, from the consumer standpoint, we see goods and services that we've been purchasing over the last 3-year period are up around 19 to 20%. But the way the COLA is calculated is driven by the fact of what is the rate of inflation increase over time. And while the inflation rates are remarkably high, and we all know and feel that, the amount that they've actually increased in the last 9 months has not been very dramatic. And so combined with all of the other factors that are used to derive the statutory COLA, that's why even though the inflation is so high, the COLA is relatively low. So some real interesting dynamics that we need to be mindful of as we move forward. We're presenting our first interim to the school board on Wednesday night. It was published with the agenda on Friday evening. And as we go through that, we'll be adjusting our projections based on what we're seeing from school services, the legislative analyst office, and ultimately our county office as well, and reflecting that in our interim presentation. And we'll go over this again at the end, but after our first interim, we'll come back with our second interim. And the second interim will reflect the most updated information we have from the legislative analyst office, and also the information that we get from the governor's budget proposal in January. So really a lot of important things to consider. And I think the way we should be thinking about this as a superintendent's budget advisory task force is everybody's going to have to tighten their belt in public education in the next few years in a pretty significant way. We have done some things that I think help us locally to deal with this in setting aside and assigning some of our funds. And I think that will help weather us a little bit. But we also know that we're stacking these elements of bad news on top of the expiration of some one-time funding that was relatively historical as well. So a lot for us to be mindful of as we move forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Hillman and Mr. Arcala to begin our first interim. And then at the end, we can take questions about the first interim or general questions about the economic landscape of the state as well. With that, Mr. Hillman or Mr. Arcala, please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Superintendent Kamick. Just a little disclaimer. We created the first interim during October and November. So as Superintendent Kamick was saying, coal is now projected at 1.27% for 24-25. At the time, you'll notice in the first interim, it's 1%. So I just want to let you know that'll be updated at second interim. And then we just certified our enrollment at 32,661. On the slides, it's going to say 32,671. Just about 10 less kids that will update everybody in the second interim and show everybody what the fiscal impact is. So all that to say, there's, it's constantly changing. So you'll see all the updates at second interim. But for right now, this is the first interim for our transactions that occurred between July and October 31st. So let's go on to here. So for the overview, just as a friendly reminder, like I said, first interim covers our budgetary status with all the transactions that occurred between July 1 and October 31. And every year, first interim reflects a more up-to-date budget now that prior year books were closed or unaudited actuals. So now we carried over a lot of those grants. Now they're included in our first interim budget, and enrollment is now updated. So you'll see those changes with first interim every year. Next slide, please. So starting at a high level, here are the key points to remember from tonight's presentation. The current year is stable, but the major story tonight comes from our multi-year projections as deficit spending increases in the out years. Deficit spending is estimated to balloon from $2 million in the current year to $17 million to $22 million in the next 2 years. Consequently, reserves are set to decrease from 8.2% to 5.8% to 3.7% in the next subsequent years. These large reductions to the fund balance have a lot to do with reductions to revenue. Revenues are decreasing mainly due to two factors, COLA and funded ADA. COLA is estimated to be 1% in 24-25 and 2% in 25-26, which is way down compared to the original projections, which were around 3 to 4%. Funded ADA is projected to go down because of pre-pandemic waivers are no longer in place. Now our 3-year average for funded ADA only includes post-pandemic ADA numbers. So consequently, our funded ADA is estimated to decrease by roughly 1,000 next year and 500 the year after that. LCFF revenues in total is estimated to decrease because of this by $6 million in 24-25 due to this double impact from COLA and funded ADA. So expenditures are also an issue in the future as they continue to climb. Since personnel makes up 85% of our budget, staffing must align with declining enrollment to balance our books. Finally, large one-time funds are expiring in the upcoming years, such as the Learning Recovery Block Grant, Discretionary Block Grant, and our Measure I parcel tax. So staffing and ongoing expenses tied to these funds are going to need to be addressed in the future. Next slide, please. So now let's drill down into the details and look at our current year's general fund unrestricted funding first. So this is our unrestricted side. So looking at the first bold line for revenues, total unrestricted revenues increased by 0.1% due to adjustments for our LCFF and our home to school transportation funding. Total expenditures increased by 0.5% as staffing was adjusted due to increased enrollment compared to adopted budget projections and budgeting savings for vacancies for this year. So we went ahead and budgeted that ahead of time, our vacancy savings. We're also spending down ending fund balance that were committed on replacing emergency supplies and transportation vehicles. So at the very, very bottom line, you see that deficit spending increased by almost $1 million at first interim. Next slide, please. Our unrestricted ending fund balance did increase after unaudited actuals as expenditures came in lower than projected. As a result, the bottom line shows our total reserves increased by roughly 0.9%. This is the total between assigned in Fund 1 and Fund 17. So at 8.2% total reserves, we're able to meet our 10% reserve cap by the state. But please note, we're going to need that 8.2% to sustain solvency as we look to deficit spending in the out years. But we'll talk more about that in our multi-year projections section. The next slide, please. So now to the restricted side that houses our categorical programs. The total revenues for restricted increased by 15.5% and total expenditures increased by 18.7%, which is normal at this time of year at first interim because we're budgeting carryover after we close the books and complete our unaudited actuals. But please note that our Title I allocations for 23-24 did increase by $2.3 million due to receiving an update on our actual funding for the current year. So that's good news. Under contributions towards the bottom of the table, we budgeted vacancy savings for our special ed positions, thus slightly bringing down our contributions from the general fund. The very bottom line shows planned deficit spending, in which we're spending down these large categorical programs, such as the Learning Recovery Block Grant and the Discretionary Block Grant. Next slide, please. So as discussed, our restricted ending fund balance, it continues showing planned deficit spending in order to spend down those large grants that we spoke about. Next slide, please. Now here are our fund balance designations for the general fund. We have non-spendables at the very top, like revolving cash and stores totaling to about $1.5 million. Restricted categorical programs have $46.8 million. Those are those large grants like the Discretionary Block Grant, the Learning Recovery Block Grant. That's in the 46.8. We committed and assigned the following dollars at the recent unaudited actuals. For example, we committed $6 million in textbook adoptions and assigned $17.8 million for future deficit spending. Next slide, please. Now here's a list of our major revenue assumptions. So I'll just highlight a few key points starting on the left side of the table. So LCFF is at $388.5 million at first interim. Funded ADA is at $32,500, while current ADA is at 94.8% or $30,973. Our unduplicated pupils, or UPP, which includes our low income foster youth and English learners, it does continue to increase, which in turn generates more LCAP supplemental funding. So LCAP funding increased by roughly $300,000 compared to 45-day budget. And also good news for enrollment. Enrollment only decreased by 35 students, which is roughly the size of a classroom. The revenue section on the right side of the table shows we budgeted carryover from our federal, state, and local revenues after closing the books. We also adjusted revenues based on updated calculations. Both home to school transportation and Title I dollars came in higher, like I said before. And so for state revenues, we received an allocation for our Prop 28 Arts Music monies. That's new news. Our Prop 28 Arts and Music money came in at $4.2 million for the year. And we're currently working on plans for those expenditures and will communicate to the board as we move forward. Measure I parcel tax funds are at $4.4 million and are set to expire in June of 2025. Next slide, please. Now, the major highlight for expenditures is that we adjusted staffing based on higher enrollment than projected. In addition, we budgeted $7.9 million in vacancy savings for the entire year. Just to let you all know, we recently worked with school services to improve our vacancy savings, and best practice is to start at first interim. That way we are on target as much as possible when we close the books. So we looked at our three-year average and our current vacancies to calculate our savings for the year. And most of those savings are coming from vacant teacher positions and special ed para positions. Next slide, please. Now for the major part of our discussion, our multi-year projections. So starting with our unrestricted MYP, the very bottom line shows that deficit spending is expected to balloon from $2 million this year to $16.9 to to $22.2 million. And this is due to LCFF revenues decreasing due to the declining ADA and COLA reductions that I spoke about in the beginning. And due to expenditures that continue to climb, such as adjustments to staffing for our growing TK population, adding 1.5% step and column to salaries, and rising inflation costs to supplies and services. Next slide, please. And as you can see, deficit spending continues to eat into our Fund 1 ending balance, going from $41.8 million to $24.9 million to $2.7 million in the next few years for our Fund 1, our general fund. Good news is that we don't expect to touch our Fund 17 special reserves and are able to sustain a 3% minimum reserve in 25-26. So Fund 17 currently remains untouched. However, a reserve of 3.7% in our third year, it's unsustainable if we continue going forward and down this path. So budget adjustments will need to be made to eliminate deficit spending and maintain fiscal solvency. Next slide, please. So our restricted MYP shows planned deficit spending, like I spoke about before, as we go from $38 million to $19 to $8 million in order to deplete those large block grants over time, like the Learning Recovery Block Grant and Discretionary Block Grant. We're spending those dollars down as we go through the years. Next slide, please. So by 25-26, you can see our large one-time grants are expected to be spent down as the ending balance goes from 28 to 9 to $0.6 million by 25-26. Next slide. So these are our major revenue assumptions for the multi-year projections. So enrollment is projected to continue declining by 150 and 85 students in the 2 subsequent years, and that's per our demographer. COLA is projected at 1% in 24-25, 2% in 25-26, and school services recently announced that tax collections are below projections, which could impact the state's ability to fund COLA. So we'll continue to learn more from the governor's January budget, and we'll keep the board posted as we learn more. The Learning Recovery Block Grant is projected to be fully spent by June of 2025, and the Discretionary Block Grant by June of 2026. Now, please note the Discretionary Block Grant, it does pay for things like, for ongoing things like $5 million in textbook adoptions, and will be returning to the general fund in 26-27. Now, for our local revenues, our Measure I parcel tax is set to expire in June of 2025. So we remove the revenue and remove the expenditures in our multi-year projections in the 25-26 fiscal year. The next slide. These are the key expenditures for our MYP. So we adjusted certificated and classified staffing based on declining enrollment, but we also increased staffing due to TK students. So we're losing students in the upper grades, but we're expecting to gain more TK students as time goes by. So consequently, we need to hire more staff for TK classes, especially since the adult to student ratio is set to increase from 12-1 currently to 10-1 in 25-26. So that's going to mean we're going to need more staff for the TK classes. PERS continues to climb over the years. In addition, supplies, utilities, and special ed contribution continues to see increases due to inflation. Next slide, please. Now, these are the one-time funds that are set to expire in the upcoming years, and we're tracking these very carefully. A majority of these programs fund staffing, so we'll have to make decisions as those funds come to an end. The next slide, please. So the main takeaway is that we are solvent for this year with 8.2% reserves, but we are deficit spending. Reserves are projected to drop from 8.2 to 5.8 to 3.7% in the subsequent years. Now, numerous one-time funding is also coming to an end, and ongoing expenses are expected to return to the general fund as these grants disappear. So budget adjustments are on the horizon, and we could only weather the upcoming storm by adjusting our budget based on our core programs and aligning staffing with enrollment. So as we hear our superintendent constantly say, we can do anything, but we can't do everything. So we'll have to make some decisions in the future. Next slide, please. So another key point is that given the nature of the current financial projections, corresponding budget reductions must be made to programs or staffing if new items are added to the budget. Budget reductions are not needed in the current year, but we'll continue to communicate with the board as we monitor our finances, learn more from the governor's January budget, and enter the next phase of our budgetary timeline, which will be second interim. Next slide, please. So good news for all other funds. They are all projected to end the year balanced and without any contributions from the general fund. And last but not least, next steps. So we'll hear more from the governor in January on his budget proposal. Also in January, we'll have the audited financial statements for 22-23, the last fiscal year. And in March, we'll come back for the second interim. May, we'll see the May revise from the governor. And finally, in June, we will come back to adopt the 24-25 budget. Thanks, everyone. Any questions?
Thanks, James. We're happy to open it up for questions. And I think if Patty, if you can just confirm, I think in the agenda, I linked for you the legislative analyst report. It's, absent the appendix, probably about 12 or 13 pages. Some of the index, or the appendix, sorry, some of the appendix is actually really good information. And I think for those of you who aren't familiar, just a reminder, the Legislative Analyst Office is an independent agency that analyzes the economic conditions and the state budget. So I think they're a pretty good metric to follow, or a pretty good pulse to follow in terms of them providing us a neutral position on things. And we had the California School Boards Association conference about a week and a half ago, and the information literally had come out that morning from Legislative Analyst Office. And as you can imagine, that was a standing room only session when they provided their update at the CSBA conference. So there's a lot to consider there. Questions in general, or questions on the first interim that the team would like to dig into? Trustee Jones, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I know we're looking at a less than expected COLA, somewhere between 0.5 and 1.5 potentially. But I know there are parts of our budget where our expenditures are going to increase by a lot more than 1.5. And I'm wondering, what comes to mind is the special ed contribution, STRS and PERS, utilities, and even step and column costs us 1.5 just to manage the step and column increases. So I'm wondering if you can tell us what maybe those other parts of the budget, how big of a jump we're going to see in those expenditures in SPED, STRS, PERS, and utilities.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a first of those that I know off the top of my head, and Director Akala can help fill in, or Mr. Hillman as well. And I think, as you point out, we average a budget estimate, as most districts do, year over year of 1.5%, just to what we say, turn the page, meaning service the salary schedule. So for our representative employees and our administrators who operate on a salary schedule, unless they're at the end of their salary schedule based on years of experience, everybody's going to move up a step each year on the salary schedule. So just to do that, when you take into account what we do with COLA each year, that's about 1.5%, which we budget. On occasions, it's a little bit higher. On occasions, it's a little bit lower. But 1.5% is a pretty fair number. We project our special ed contribution from the general fund to go up by about $500,000, I believe, for next year. And so obviously that's a unique situation, because we've talked in this forum a number of times about how underfunded special education is at the federal level. And we want to make the contribution from the general fund because it's what our students need and deserve. But it creates a fiscal challenge for us, because we're funding a program that is ideally funded at 40% by the federal government. And since it's not, we're funding it out of the general fund with a contribution. The other numbers that we expect to increase, Director Akala, in terms of STRS and PERS rates, and some of our other estimates in terms of goods and services.
Yeah, our STRS and PERS rates are on average increase. Well, our STRS rate is staying the same at 19.1%, but the PERS rate, that's the one that's increasing by roughly on average about 0.8% every year. So that's looking, to increase from year to year. And then our utilities are looking to increase roughly around 10%, which is roughly equivalent to $1 million each year. So our utilities They're going up pretty quickly. But you touch upon all the major ones, Superintendent.
One other thing I'd like to add to for the group is that, and this goes back to the unit in math that I failed when I was in high school about percentages. So when we talk about a COLA, and let's just say for a second, the COLA is 1%, that's not the same dollar amount as a 1% increase in SPED contributions, because the SPED contribution is about $500,000. That's what we're budgeting for. That's what we're expecting. It's a 1% increase, $500,000, but that's not the same thing, the same dollar amount as a 1% COLA. A 1% COLA is going to yield us a far larger number because it's based upon the full budget. And so when you're comparing percentages, be very careful. You know, they don't pay us in percentages as much as they pay us in dollars. And so it's important when you're talking about percentages that we don't confuse them, especially out in the community, when they say we got a 1% COLA and then but utilities are going up 10%. How are we going to make up the 9% difference? It doesn't really work that way. So this is where the devil in the details comes in, and this is why James and his team are so good, is that they've got all of this detail in the budget book. A little bit of it, the snapshot you just saw in the PowerPoint presentation, you can pick out certain numbers and start to compare them. But just be careful comparing percentages. It took me about 15 years to figure that out. And it's great because in this role I figured it out, but in high school I didn't have that figured out. So
That's a good
And
point.
Mr. Hillman, I
Okay.
think you bring up that point is well noted in terms of the step and column that we average as an estimated cost as well, right? Because that's 1.5%, and that's a different measurement of percentage than the COLA or the special ed increase. And it really is about the dollars. So for example, when we estimate a cost of 1%, which is a term you hear in education a lot, that's an estimate of how much would it cost a school district to provide a 1% pay increase to all employees. And so, you know, it's, as Mr. Hillman pointed out, moving from the percentages to the dollars is really where it's most critical, because that 1% for Fremont Unified School District, I think, is somewhere this year around 3.65 or $3.75 million. And so, you know, it's really important to look at the dollars. Also, one thing we've talked about here a little bit in terms of when we get a COLA, let's just say, following Mr. Hillman's example, when we get a COLA, let's just say, for conversation's sake, it's 1%. Well, if you have declining enrollment, you're actually not going to see a 1% increase in your revenue. You're going to see less than that because we're funded based on our ADA. So there's a number of factors that we have to look at, and really what we want to do once we get the governor's budget proposal is we'll put that into our formulas, and then we'll actually find out dollar for dollar how much new revenue are we anticipating, and then what do our estimates show us about the estimated increase in our expenditures versus our estimated increase in revenue. But clearly, you know, something we need to watch. You see that deficit spending, which we've been working so hard to bring down to almost a balanced budget. When you look at a $2 million deficit for this year from where we started 4.5 years ago, that's a significant marked improvement for us. And it's a bit disheartening and frustrating to see it go back up for things beyond our control. But when looking at the LAO's forecast, we do see that they continue to project very slow economic growth in the current year and the next year. But I think they project in 25, 26 that it then starts to pick back up again. Let me just search through my my highlights there and make sure. 24 and 25, they project some revenue growth returning. So, you know, hopefully that will be the case, but we are all going to have to find a way to weather this storm a bit. And I think we're all very curious to see how the state plans on approaching it, because this is the first time they've really had a substantive amount of money in reserve to address what we might all consider a rainy day. And I'm sure I don't have to be the weatherman here. There's a news flash, it's raining. So we'll see how they respond. Other questions or perspectives or comment on the first interim or the general budget picture? Michelle, yes, please go ahead.
Yes, question I had, I didn't get the page, James, but I noticed that you had, it was after like attrition, looking at the salaries, and across the board it showed like 2 million each year going up for certificated. It went on classified, it went 2 million going up, but the last year it went down. And I was wondering why it was classified down when the certificated was up.
There you go. Yeah, good question, Michelle. Yeah, so what we're really looking at in our projections is to look at adjusting our personnel based on declining enrollment, which is something we haven't done for multiple years now. So as we look forward, we're going to have to kind of look at how does classified staffing align with enrollment and where should we be? And another thing, in the 25-26 year, we also removed the expenditures for our parcel tax, assuming if a parcel tax is not removed, because we're kind of leaning on the conservative end, we removed the classified positions that were there as well, and the certificated positions and the revenue that had to do with parcel tax.
And so, James, just to clarify for the group, while we certainly hope and believe that we'll have community support to pass a renewal of the parcel tax, from a budgeting perspective, until that ballot measure is officially passed, it would be the sound fiscal practice to design your budget as if the revenue were going away, no matter how confident we might be in the community support, correct? Okay. Liz, please go ahead.
First of all, ignore my sad face, Michelle. My computers keeps telling me the internet is wonky, so hopefully you can hear me right now. It's trying to raise my hand. Actually, my computer is being a little wonky, and I was wondering, Patty, or if you could send me the agenda. It won't give me access, probably because the invite was sent to Vicky, but I don't have access currently right now. Thank you.
Any other questions on the first interim? So as you might be thinking of a few final questions, just a reminder, as Director Akala pointed out, I think if the dates are correct, Mr. Akala, it is July to October, that window that we're looking at for the first interim. So remember, this is a snapshot, and ultimately what we aim to do is have the first interim be as accurate as it can. And then we get the next snapshot and we try and make the second interim even more accurate and build in the governor's budget proposal. This will be a unique year for school districts, I think, in terms of trying to read the political tea leaves. It's a unique time for the November election. When we get to November at the state level, there are going to be a lot of moving parts. We've seen the governor, my own political perspective here, which I'm not a political expert, but we've seen the governor engage on a global and national landscape, which to me tells me that he's looking more nationally than locally. And so I think he has a lot of political capital invested in what this budget looks like as well. So we'll have to see how he steers the legislature, which he has historically been able to do somewhat well, even though they have their own priorities. They tend to find a compromise that's relatively predictable, but this year I think will be a little bit unique. There's going to be a lot of pressure on local legislators, and as always, a good reminder for us to be talking to our locally elected officials about what we want protected. There's years where we go and advocate for increased funding. I don't think that's going to be in the cards for anybody. I think this is going to be a year to go out and advocate for the things we want protected for our students and ultimately for our staff. Trustee Jones?
Yeah, when we talk about aligning staffing to enrollment and, reducing positions essentially, and knowing that in the last few years, we've been able to do that with retirements and, people leaving the district of their own accord. Knowing that we are going into a year where, we probably had a lot of staff members who maybe had thought about retiring last year stay because of the increase that we were able to provide. We may, in this coming year, have essentially 2 years worth of retirements that hit us. Do we anticipate that may be enough, Or do you and think that we are gonna have to do some targeted looks at our staffing to potentially, no one wants to hear this, but it's the reality, layoffs?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. We've been able to handle a lot in Fremont Unified just due to attrition, due to the size of our district. And I think that attrition may be able to cover us for one more year, but that's something that we're certainly looking at with our HR department and with our business office. I think a big part of that will really depend on as we get the demographers report in January and we look at our internal enrollment projections, because our, what we projected to be a significant decline in enrollment this year turned out to be 45, 35 students, Director Akala. So that really wouldn't lead us to do many layoffs from a certificated standpoint. And from a classified standpoint, we really have to look at, well, I guess in certificated as well, where do those pockets fall? There's an outside chance that if that bubble is, let's say smaller at one area of the elementary schools, that might look a little bit different. If there was a small bubble at the secondary level, that might look a little bit different. But with the declining enrollment, not statistically, but conceptually kind of flattening out this year, I'm going to hold out hope that that's our pattern for next year as well. And that should help preserve our staffing. We would like to hopefully find the right balance between attritions, as you pointed out, Trustee Jones. I think we will likely see some retirements for people who've been holding out for another year or two, because our last 3 years were pretty significant or historic 3-year settlements in terms of compensation. And so we may see an increase in retirements at the end of this year because people may see in the future that there may not be large scale pay increases available in the next 2-year budget window. So we'll be watching that closely. It is possible. I don't want to say that it's not. It is possible that we may need to do some targeted reductions in force, but likely targeted and small in area.
Well, I think too, this is an area that I think about with our legislators, is that we're looking at, nationwide shortages of education professionals, from teachers to bus drivers to, everybody, because we just can't pay the kinds of wages that are competitive elsewhere. And if districts, especially in California, because of this budget year, are looking at layoffs, we're going to lose these people permanently. They're not going to come back to education. And our legislators need to be thinking about what the impact of that is on us moving forward. Because, we need, it's just, see, we were at the CSBA conference together and it was rough. It was rough listening to all these projections and hearing about the political landscape. And I don't know how we talk to our legislators effectively to help them understand, when we have to make cuts to weather 1 year or 2 years, the impact of that is a decade to us, as we lose people who won't come back.
Yeah, it's a very valid point that you're making, and I think something that our legislators who don't have any practical education experience other than the fact that they have gone through school don't necessarily understand that in the context in which we feel it. And it's really difficult. And the net impact of reductions in force does carry forward with it a significant implication, not only for one local district, but if it's happening across a region, it's so negative. We saw so many people leave the profession in the 08-09 time period when we had to reduce budgets across the state. And we certainly don't want to see that happen again. And so I think that's where the advocacy helps, because I think we want to encourage our legislators to do the things they can do to help us, whether it's give us flexibility, whether it's allow us some grace in certain provisions, where they don't have to necessarily spend money to help us save money. So we'll see what we can do there, but a good advocacy point. We'll go to Vanita and then Ganesh. Go ahead, Vanita.
Thank you, CJ. First of all, let me tell you that I'm not sure whether I'm supposed to be here or not. I'm not sure whether, but I saw this on my calendar and I said, okay, I need to be here. So that's why I'm here. talking about advocacy, that is exactly what I was thinking about. CJ and Diane, both of you have put really you have put it very well together, about how we need to do advocacy at the legislative level. And if you are not aware, there is a bill, HR 4519, IDEA Full Funding Act. It's a federal level bill, and we have around 130 senators or legislators who have co-sponsored this bill. But that speaks the volume. The bill is about funding special ed classes fully, and that has been a sour pill for most of the educators and people who have been working in the education field, because we do support special ed fully 100%, but we don't get funded. And that is something that we might want to talk more to our legislators, even though our legislators in Fremont both of them have signed it. But I would still recommend us to rally it and talk more about it, talk to our voters in Fremont and beyond, and talk about this particular bill. I think this will take a good slice away from our current issues and future issues that we continue to have. But it's really hard to see that we are at the same place as we are every year, where we are talking about doing layoffs, cutting budget. I feel that in past 20 years, the conversations have not changed. And I don't have an answer for it. All I can say is that let's continue doing what we are doing and look forward for the measure that we are talking about to continue funding our Measure I bill that we are bringing up again. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanita. That's a great point. And to give context to what you're saying about the federal funding, if the federal government funded special ed at the 40% level they promised, just for context, that would wipe out the ballooning deficit spending of $20+ million and probably still give us, by my last calculation, another $40 million to figure out what to do with in our favor. Because when you look at our general fund contribution, we're looking at roughly back in 22-23, roughly a $62 million number. So you can imagine what Fremont Unified could do if the circumstances were changed with federal government funding. Ganesh, please go ahead.
Thank you. Just largely want to echo what Trustee Jones and Vinita were kind of saying over here, but my further question on that is in terms of advocacy. We can individually reach out to legislators and try to speak to them, but since folks here came out of it sounded like a meeting with other school boards in California, is there some attempts to do coordinated advocacy both at the federal level, like Vinita was speaking about, and at the state level? Like, what can we do in a more coordinated fashion versus just individually reaching out?
Great question. So there's a few things that happen. The California School Boards Association, the conference we were at, which most districts in California belong to, they have statewide legislative advocacy efforts that take place on behalf of school boards. They also have some more regional efforts that take place. So our CSBA region is referred to as Region 7. And so regionally, some of our school boards will contact elected officials and go through that same process. And then statewide, there's other agencies that will advocate as well. SEIU, CSCA, and CTA, as part of the labor faction of the state, will advocate at the legislative level for the things that they would like to see happen in the budget standpoint. And then I am part of the Superintendent's Council for the state of California for the Association of California School Administrators. And so we advocate at the state level as well. So those are some of the organized efforts that take place. And then as a district, we also have taken the opportunity the last 2 years, and this will be the third year that we do it. And we go to Washington, D.C. in April and meet with our elected officials. I think we're lucky in the local area when we meet with Ro Khanna and Eric Swalwell. They have both been wildly supportive of trying to protect our funding. And I think they have both endorsed the HR 4591 bill already and have authored their support behind it. So we're lucky there. Now it's my job to go find some people who are opposed to it and start telling them the stories that they need to hear to understand why they need to change their opposition. Mr. Hillman.
One other thing I would mention is that that's on the federal level, of course. And I think at the state level, an easy thing to ask for, whether it's in singles or in groups, is that, but what most people don't realize about the state budget is that they are currently looking at the money that they received in November is really last year's income taxes, right? And so normally they would have had that information, like Mr. Kamek said, in the spring to pass a budget in the June of 2023. They didn't have it until after this fiscal year has started. So they're making adjustments to a year that's already done using money they just now received, or didn't in this case receive, they didn't get it. So they're short in last year, $26 billion. So one of the key things that we can advocate for that's very simple is basically saying, don't cut education in the current year. Don't do a mid-year cut. Use the rainy day fund and let schools be, and figure out your budget problem, state, with all the other things you pay for. But don't mess with schools mid-year, because mid-year cuts are incredibly devastating to schools. And frankly, there aren't a lot of options mid-year, right? The school year started. We're already at the semester mark. So if you want to advocate for, get the word out, you can get large groups of people to buy into a concept of, hey, we see the state, you've got a problem over the next 3 years. We get it. And the schools are willing to do something in the second and the third year, but don't mess with us this year. Use the rainy day fund. It's been set up for this exact purpose so that we avoid mid-year cuts like we had in 07, 08, the Great Recession. That is a Prop 98 rainy day fund. Use it. It's raining. So that's an easy thing to kind of advocate for and get that word out. There's probably someone cleverer than me come up with a cool hashtag or something, and then jump on that and share it among all the different alphabet soup groups that Superintendent Kamek was talking about. There's CSBA, there's the superintendents, there's the association that James and I belong to, CASBO. They all have legislative analysts, including all of our labor partners. This is something we could easily get on board with and push it out. And I think that most people would be receptive to it, including the people that have to vote on it, the legislature. So just to go a step deeper.
Yeah, and I have some upcoming meetings that we're scheduling right now with State Senator Wahab and Assembly Member Lee to come out and visit some of our sites from a facilities perspective so that they can understand the importance of the state investing in school facilities. And I'm sure you can all imagine how much I'm going to bend their ear about the current fiscal dilemma that we see. So we have about 2 or 3 minutes left before we close. So we'll ask Vanita and Ganesh to offer their comments in that time spirit, and then we'll project towards our next meeting. Vanita, go ahead.
So talking about Prop 98, if we talk about Prop 98, and I have been talking about it for a long time, so I can tell you the numbers. So Prop 9, at state level, I have done quite a lot of advocacy about Prop 98. Unfortunately, it all falls on the deaf ears, because even though our assembly members are on, they understand the issues, but when it comes to the state level, it just does not math. So I think what we need to do is not only talk about the minimum of Prop 98, because that is what is happening. We are getting the the promise of minimum in Prop 98 has become maximum in our budget, which is what we need to change. We need to talk about, we need to remind them that that was the minimum number. 2% was the minimum number. It was not the maximum number. And they need to honor the promises that made in Prop 98 at the state level. So thank you.
Thank you. And yes, that's a point well noted, Vanita. The Prop 98 sets up a minimum guarantee for education funding. And unfortunately, they have risen to the minimum bar time and time again. And we certainly would encourage them to train for the high jump and see if they can clear that bar a little bit. Ganesh, last comments before we close.
Yeah, thank you. I heard some really good ideas. Thank you for sharing those on the advocacy. I was just wondering if, how do we bring the parent community into that? Is there enough awareness of what you guys are doing from an advocacy perspective? Is there a problem to doing that? Like, is there some conflict of interest with doing anything like that? Or can we actually inform our parents, like, we're short as part of these presentations, and this is a bunch of advocacy that the district and people involved are doing, and how you can join that? Because otherwise it feels really hard to try and create something of our own.
Yeah, no, we certainly can. And oftentimes in these circumstances, we'll partner with some of our PTA organizations or FCPTA, for example, and we'll write a shared letter of advocacy to our elected officials and to the governor and to some of the governor's staff. And we can certainly work on doing that as well in the coming months. That's something that we have done historically in other districts, and I'm fairly confident that Fremont has done a version of that before my arrival. And one of the things that speaks volumes is when we can author a letter together and have some groups sign off on it together. So a letter from our school district signed by our board, signed by our FCPTA group, signed by our labor partners, because that tells the people receiving that letter at the state level that this isn't just a singular viewpoint. This is the collective group of people who care most about the students in the state. And if we're all signing off on the same letter, then that starts to send a powerful message. So I can work on that with our groups as well and with our FCPTA partnership. And we can, also partner with groups that aren't part of the formal PTA process that have PTOs in their sites as well. So we can work on a shared communication of advocacy. And with that, we will begin to close this meeting as we start our board budget subcommittee meeting in just a few minutes. Normally, I would ask for future agenda items, but our next meeting is January 29th, 2024. And we will all have started our New Year's resolutions by then, whatever they may be. We'll have to see how many of us are still on them by then. But what will be first and foremost in that agenda is going to be a debrief of the governor's budget proposal and what it means for Fremont Unified. So he should be releasing that January 10th. And by the 29th, we will have had all of the major agencies, school services, the legislative analysts, AXA, CASBO, CSBA, capital advisors who we partner with. They will all be engaged in analyzing that budget and advising school districts on what to expect. And so we'll be reviewing that information and bringing it back to this group. And that will help fine tune some of our advocacy points, because we'll get a real clear picture of what the governor wants to do with this budget. And that's where we can advocate to the governor and then also to the legislature with some pointed things to say, do this with the governor's budget proposal, or don't do this with the governor's budget proposal. So a lot of information will be forthcoming on the 29th as we look at that budget. Thank you very much for being at this meeting. I wish all of you and all of your families a joyous holiday season and Happy New Year. I know for many of you it can't get here soon enough, but I hope when it does get here, I hope you enjoy a break and some time to reflect on the blessings that exist for each of us, whatever they may be. Take care, everybody, and have a great rest of your night.